I remember it very clearly. You see, I was at a picnic with my mom and dad, and we were at a place called Beaver Creek State Park, which is one of the places we always went to have picnics. And by our picnic table, there was a large tree that was Y-shaped. And it was a nice tree. It was a beautiful tree. And somehow, through a series of what I call rather unfortunate events, I was in the tree. I was not in the tree because I climbed said tree, because, let's face it, God did not grant me the body of a climber. God grant me the body of a reader, which is what I would have preferred to be doing on the ground, not 6 feet up high in a tree. My dad put me in the tree because, I don't know, he wanted me to see what it was like to be in a tree. He wanted me to climb a tree. I don't know. But all I knew was that I was in the tree, and I absolutely 100% did not want to be there at all. And so I did what any child forced in a situation that they are uncomfortable in does. I panicked. I panicked a lot because I'm in a tree, and I don't want to fall out of said tree. And yet, my fear of not wanting to fall out of said tree was exactly what my dad said I should do. He said, okay, look, you don't have to stay in there. Just jump out of the tree. And it was at this point I thought he had lost his marbles because he was asking me to jump out of a tree. And he kept saying, no, it's fine. Just jump out of a tree. I promise you, it's going to be okay. I will catch you. It wasn't until I was older and had kids of my own that I really understood what that meant, because there are times when my kids would climb trees and they would get stuck like cats. And again, God did not grant me the body of a tree climber at all, especially as I got older. So the only thing I could do would tell my kids, look, it's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. Just jump out of the tree, and I promise I will catch you. When I was a kid, I understood that logically my dad was going to be able to catch me. And I understand as an adult that logically I'm going to be able to catch my kids when they jump out of a tree. But logic doesn't always work, does it? Even though something looks safe, even though something should be safe, and for all intents and purposes is safe, there are still times when we are afraid. It's like there's some sort of disconnect in our heads because we see what's going on, and maybe it's safe, but it's definitely not safe. Because did you know on the news they said that this soup broth will kill you, but it's not the soup broth. It's this like chemical that sometimes gets put in soup broth, and that's only if you have like so much of it. But then what happens? Then the news that you're watching at that hour says this other thing in your house is going to kill you. Find out more at 11. And so now, after 6 o'clock, you now have to stay up until 11 to see what else is in your house that could possibly kill you. And it keeps us in this constant state of fear. It keeps us in this state of anxiousness and almost panic to where we can't do anything. I think that's the problem that we have as people, that sometimes as a society we are just too pessimistic, that we see bad news, we take it to heart, and we think it's over, it's done, that's it, man, game over, we're done for. And that's how we look at the world. And because of that, we do the only thing that our bodies tell us to do, which is that we become afraid. And maybe this is why the story of David and Goliath is so fascinating to me. I have to confess, I love this story because whenever I read David and Goliath, it always plays out in my head like some PG-13 action movie, right? Like you have the handsome young kid, and he's all willing to fight the 9-foot-tall giant. In fact, one time I was reading a story, a Bible story to my kids, and I was reading David and Goliath, and sling, he throws it, hits him and he falls over and the story just ended. And me, wanting to raise good theologians, was like, no, that's not the end of the story. Well, what do you mean? What's the end of the story? Well, the end of the story is David runs over to Goliath, picks up his sword, which is probably like a great sword, but also really big because, again, Goliath's a giant. So he picks up his sword, brings it down on his neck, and cleaves his head right off. And my wife was like, no. There's a reason they leave that part out. Like, nobody wants to illustrate that in a kid's book. That's what gives it the PG-13 rating, that action moment right there. And we love this story. We love this story because what we want to be is David, right? You know, here's the handsome young kid. The odds are stacked against him. And we use this phrase a lot, the David versus Goliath story, right? When someone faces insurmountable odds, and that's who we want to be. We want to be the plucky young hero here. And yet 9 times out of 10, we're the Israelite army shaking and terrified. See, before our story takes place, Goliath comes out and he tells everyone, all right, look, send out your champion. They'll fight me. If I win, you'll be our slaves. And if they win, we'll be your slaves. And of course, nobody wants to fight the 9-foot-tall giant because, again, 9-foot-tall giant. Then along comes David, who hears Goliath talking all this smack about God. And he's like, you guys are really letting him do this. You guys are cowards. Okay, I'm going to go kill him. He's like, what do you mean? You're like a 15-year-old kid. And he's like 9 foot tall, and you're going to fight him. Yeah, what, like that's hard? And so he goes to Saul, and he says, okay, yeah, I'm going to go kill the Philistine. I don't know why I have to come here first. Like, can't I just go out there and do that? And Saul's like, this is a terrible idea. That is a 9 foot tall, whole grown adult person who has been trained as a warrior since childhood. And David's like, nah, it's fine. Seriously, I'm a shepherd. Like, I've killed bears, I've killed lions. That's no problem for me. Plus, you know, I have God on my side. And that right there is the crux of the whole thing. He firmly and 110% believes that he has God on his side. Because God is with him, that allows David to do that which is impossible, to slay the giant. I said earlier that oftentimes we are more the Israelite army in the story. That's at our worst times, when we're paralyzed by fear and we don't want to do something because we're afraid of how it looks. One of the things, whenever you watch fights, like boxing, MMA, when you watch wrestling and all this stuff, they do what's called the tail of the tape, right? And the tail of the tape is this guy's this tall and weighs this long, and here's his reach, and here's his opponent, and this is what they're doing. And so you compare and you contrast the two and their stats, and you try to see who's going to win. And if you did that with this match, it's a no-brainer. Because Goliath is going to win every time. Not only is he a giant, but he is a trained giant. Logic dictates that David has to lose. But God defies logic at times. David knows this, which is why he does that. The army seems to have forgotten this. At our worst, we are the army. At our best, we are King Saul. Because King Saul does everything that we do when we are afraid. He hears David, and he doesn't say, you're crazy, this is not happening, which, again, logically, he should absolutely do it. But David was maybe just very persuasive. And Saul says, yeah, okay. You can absolutely do it. Go kill the giant, buddy. Good luck. God be with you. He said, hold on. Okay, here's a helmet. He puts a large bronze helmet on him. Here's some chainmail, which chainmail, while not as heavy or as necessarily protective as full plate, is still really heavy. Full plate is kind of like the suits of armor that we see. Chainmail are the little links. And again, while they're not super heavy, it is pretty heavy. And he straps his own sword, which again, you got to think, Saul being king would want like this glorious, bejeweled, encrusted sword, right? maybe not a great sword, but probably more like a long sword. You could hold it one hand, or you could do it two-handed to get more oomph, but that's what Saul would have used. And David's sitting there with a helmet that's too big, with armor that just doesn't fit right, and a sword that's too big for him to use, and he tries to walk, and he can't. And he says, "What? I can't do this like this. This doesn't make sense, Saul. This is not how this is not how I function. This is how you function. This is how you want it to be done. You're micromanaging here, King. Just let me go do what I need to do." And that's exactly what we do. When the world is chaotic, when the world is out of order, what is it we strive for? Order. Something to bring us back from the grips of chaos. So oftentimes when we are afraid, when we are panicking, what do? We micromanage. We control every little thing that we can possibly control because the world feels so far out of our control. Saul here knows and understands that God is with David. Saul here knows and understands that David can win this fight. It is a long shot. But if modern Hollywood cinema and the Bad News Bears has taught me anything, sometimes the long shot pays off. Sometimes it doesn't. But sometimes it does. That's what Saul believes, that he can do it. But there's still that little bit of doubt, which is why he tries his best to have it done his way. And it can't work like that. We want to be David. David has the faith. David did the cool work of slaying the giant. That's what we want to be. It's not because he killed the giant, but it was really because of his faith. That's what we admire about David. Just the fact that he had so much faith that he could do the impossible, because at the end of the day, no matter how pessimistic we may seem, we're optimistic. We have the greatest power inside of us, the power of hope. That power of hope is what's going to be able to carry us on through the tough times and through the challenges. But we have to also couple that with our faith and our willpower. It's very important. Hope by itself is not necessarily going to get the job done, but it's the will to do that. It's the will to do that which seems impossible because you believe in something bigger than yourself. Because we know that we necessarily can't do something, but with God, all things are possible. He was calm. David had no reason to be calm at all. It should not in any way, shape, or form logically have ended the way that it did, but it did because of God. David was not afraid. Anything that would have happened would have been fine with David because he would have gone out in a blaze, not of glory, but of faith. He knew God was with him. That actually makes me feel really sad for the disciples in our gospel reading today. So, all the disciples are on a boat with Jesus. And they go out, and a storm kicks up. And granted, it is a terrible storm. It is a horrifyingly bad storm. The boats are rocking, the waves are coming up over, the deck's getting swamped. Everyone's running around, panicking, thinking, this is it, man, this is the end. And Jesus, in the midst of the chaos, is fast asleep, napping through the trouble. The good news here for us is whenever we think, what would Jesus do, and we have a problem, apparently napping in the middle of a crisis is A-okay. So the disciples go and they wake Jesus up, and I can't understand why they did. Most of the disciples by trade were fishermen. Fishermen who have spent their whole lives on a boat because their dads and their uncles and everyone else would have taught them the family business, how to be a fisherman. And surely they would have known how to navigate through storms. Yes, this was a terrifying storm. However, there is some point where you have to just get your courage, gather up all the courage you can, and power on through it. And that is where the disciples should have found themselves. They were very much like David in a situation that they could have gotten their way out of, but they felt like they couldn't. So they run downstairs and they do what all kids who are scared in the middle of the night do. They wake up the person in charge. They say, "Jesus, wake up! Do you not know what's going on? We're going to die. Do you not care? What is wrong with you? We are dying out there." And Jesus is just like, "You woke me up for this." And he tells the wind to stop. And he gets up on the deck, rubs the sleep from his eyes, he commands everything, "Peace, be still." And then everything stops. And the disciples are all oohing and awing, and we get this amazing story of the power of God, but then Jesus chastises the disciples just a little bit. Do you guys still not have enough faith? It's a good question. It's a good question because the disciples would have seen a lot of miraculous things, right? And oftentimes we think of miracles and things like that as something that would be incontrovertible proof of God's existence. They literally were watching this. The healings, the casting out of demons, all that stuff. None of that is normal by any stretch of the imagination. And Jesus is just walking around doing lay on hands and like healing everybody and throwing demons out, exorcising them and whatnot. And it's amazing and it's astounding. They were at the wedding where Jesus said, "Let's have more wine," turn the water into wine. They saw all this. They saw all of these things that defied expectation. And Jesus always said, "Be with me and I will grant you peace." And Jesus was with them, physically with them, and still, what were they doing? They were freaking out. They were panicking. The disciples knew. They absolutely knew all this stuff about Jesus. They had seen all this stuff about Jesus. It was wonderful and it was great and everything. And they had Jesus with them. And it still wasn't enough for them. I'm not necessarily trying to be hard on the disciples. What I'm trying to do is illustrate a point. In our Old Testament story, we are at worst the army. At best, we are King Saul. And in this story, we find ourselves always, always, always as the disciples. God be with you. Emmanuel, God with you. God with us. Jesus, God made flesh for us. Resurrected, sitting on the right hand of the Father, coming to judge the quick and the dead, and all that good stuff. And we know all that, right? We have faith in Jesus. So why is it then when the going gets tough, when the rubber meets the road, we freak out? Is it because we forget? Kind of. It's because, as Frank Herbert put it in his novel Dune, fear is the mind killer. Fear is what stops us from doing that which we should do or that which we could do. Fear is that little voice in the back of your head saying, "No, you can't." It's like somebody who deals with anxiety, their brain is like, "Hey, we're going to panic today." And the person's like, "Awesome, what are we panicking about?" "Don't know, just going to panic." "Cool." That's how we live our lives when it comes to seeing the world around us. When we see all the bad news and all of this stuff, we become paralyzed by fear, and we start to overthink, and we start to micromanage, and we start to panic, and then we get ulcers, and nobody likes ulcers. Then we get heartburn, and everyone really hates heartburn, and then you have to go on special diets, and you can't have hot sausage because you're on special diets, and everything just stinks. When really, we need to learn one thing. God is with us. That's it. That's the most important thing in the world. God is with us. And if God is with us, and God constantly tells us that it's going to be okay, it's going to be fine, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you, I will never abandon you, then at what point do we actually live like those words are true? Because that's the secret to how David was able to do what he did. He just believed. I made a promise to my kids a long time ago that I would never promise them anything if I couldn't do it. I will always say things like, I will do the best that I can. If I promise something, that means I am going to do it. So I make promises very sparingly. But when I make a promise, my word is bond, and I promise that I will get it done. Now, I'm just a guy with no body to climb trees. I am a simple person who can fail. God, however, is not. God always makes promises, and what I can promise you today in the midst of those promises is that God tells us it's going to be okay. That is the faith that we hold on to. That is what we remember in times of danger, in times of stress, in times of anxiety, that God tells us it's going to be okay. That's how we know. It's not just hearing. It's not just knowing. It's living as if everything is going to be okay. Amen.